So Barbara and I will talk about machine translation and its didactics. And since Emilia was mentioning Netflix, I would want to ask in the round if anybody has seen Stranger Things. Yeah, okay. So some people are aware of the Mind Flayer. And our topic very much reminded me of the story of the Mind Flayer, who is a monster that lives in the underworld or the world down under, and everybody in our world is very happy and doing our thing. So in our world there are translators, and this Mind Flayer is then pushing into our world and turning our world upside down. And this is actually the case with artificial intelligence nowadays. It's in everybody's mind, and everybody's mind is played with the artificial intelligence and what will happen with us. But the Mind Flayer, or the artificial intelligence, or better to say machine translation, is not a new development. What you see here is a screenshot from the IBM and Georgetown University cooperation, where they developed the first let me say, successful machine translation, and this was in the 50s. And today, the Mind Flayer is actually also arrived in our world. So let's have a look what is going on currently in machine translation, in artificial intelligence world, and how we can cope as a profession, but also as didactics in this field. Why we too want to tell you something about it is because we were a year ago involved in a machine translation project. This was a EU Council presidency translator. I will give you some information on the project, and then Barbara will tell you a bit more about this project. So this was a real life, so to say, development of a machine translation engine, of training of the engine, and here we have some good insight in how to customize machine translation and also how to involve our students in this work. Good. So I think we don't need to talk about machine translation very much. It's here. Yeah? It's everywhere in the media. Everybody is gone nuts for machine translation. There is a very strong vertical distribution of machine translation in almost all industries. Also in the industries that were considered not very ideal for machine translation, such as, for example, medicine and so on. There, for example, also patient records and so on are currently translated via machine translation. Of course, there is also a very large ubiquity of machine translation in various language pairs that we have not seen before. There has been very good progress in horizontal distribution with AI in language combinations that were not covered well before. And of course, everybody and his uncle basically uses machine translation, the non-mentionable one and so on, in private context to read TripAdvisor recommendations and so on with the help of machine translation. So it's here. We also see that there is increasing studies into the post-editing services that are demanded by the industry, and also there is a need to train our students in this field. This is not a new development. This has been going on for 20 plus years, of course. And last but not least, why this should be of interest for us, students are using machine translation for their home assignments, in their professional or private context. We see a very big discrepancy between very naive use of machine translation, as colleague Colette Nikoroshets in Maribor has found out, or, for example, our study with Barbara of our students, where we saw that students are quite skeptical towards use of machine translation. So here we also see different approaches towards use of machine translation in students. But let's have a look at the latest development in neuro-machine translation. I don't want to bore you with the history and with the technical specific of neuro-machine translation, but this is the latest development in the field, and quality evaluation by different authors for various text typology, for various language combinations show really good results. However, various post-editing effort studies have been done by also our colleagues, and here we see that although the effort is lower in overall perception, the results are quite conservative. So here we don't see the general industry jumping on the bandwagon that machine translation and post-editing is the answer for all problems, especially in sense of time management. So here we still see conservative results, mainly because the way of post-editing will probably need to change with the neuro-machine translation. Although neuro-machine translation is very fluent, makes, let's say, in general less errors than other approaches, but the errors are different, are rather human-like, means they're also quite hard to detect. So they're not very obvious errors that are made, that every machine would make, but errors that humans would make. So this brings us back to us. Who is the expert on errors in human-made translations? Translators. This also brings us to the post-editing competence. There are several parts of the post-editing competence and machine translation competence in the EMT competence strategy. You are well aware with this. I want to show you a international standard on post-editing, the ISO 18587, translation services, post-editing of machine translation output, where you see basically in parallel with the EMT what is required here. Translation competence, linguistic and textual competence, competence in research and information mining again, cultural competence, technical competence, and domain competence. So basically, we are here very much in sync. However, and I know this is also mentioned in the EMT framework, there is explicitly a mention of a general knowledge of machine translation technology and a basic understanding of common errors that an MT system makes. So here's also an additional technological dimension, but this is also already covered in the new EMT framework. So we should be actually on a good track. However, the technological competence brings us also to new challenges when we look at the post-editing competence and neural machine translation. Previous work, for example, by Sharon O'Brien, has discussed quite in detail the competence of machine translation post-editors versus translators versus revisers, and has postulated that there should be different strategies how to teach machine translation post-editing versus translation versus revision. If you have a look, this was a study done in 2002, meaning that this was very much in sense of, so to say, statistical and other approaches that are nowadays considered not very en vogue. A new study by Yamada shows that there is a similar distribution between errors that the neuromachine translation makes and humans makes. So this brings us, so to say, back to the post-editing competence and to the EMT competence, and to see that the humans and the machine currently make more or less very, very similar mistakes. This also begs the question, when should we include machine translation and post-editing. Up until now, this was usually a part of, so to say, advanced studies when somebody was already well aware of translation strategies and so on, and this was, so to say, a technological dimension. I cannot give you a definite answer. The developments are very new, but here are some ideas by other colleagues. For example, Yamada postulates that translation training should be a prerequisite for machine translation post-editing, meaning that machine translation post-editing comes on top of the general translation revision competence. We should be aware of this in sense of the EMT network, so to say. Other colleagues have postulated, for example, that revision experience is needed as prerequisite for machine translation post-editing, meaning not translation, but I would say just revision experience. Here, of course, we can discuss if revision is possible without translation experience and so on. And there are also other colleagues coming from language learning dimension who are also using machine translation as a language learning tool, meaning, so to say, in the beginning of the training. So here you have different approaches when it should be suitable, especially with new neural networks. These questions also bring us to the question, when is it feasible or how to integrate machine translation into teaching? Most of the courses probably integrate machine translation into a general technology course module, or sometimes part as a project management, quality management course, and so on. This seems to be changing. We had a look at quite a few of the curricula that explicitly address machine translation and post-editing, and there seems to be an uptake in stand-alone courses on machine translation or machine translation post-editing. There are also some specialized MA courses on this track. There's also a new emergence of courses that deal specifically with machine translation project management, going away from the traditional translation project management, but also incorporating aspects of training of engines, of preparing the training material, parallel corpora terminology, and so on. So this is also something that we can observe in some curricula that are maybe more dynamic than others. On the other hand, we also see that mostly post-editing seems to become quite a standard part of revision or translation courses, or courses where you deal with specific language pairs, especially if you have technology courses that, so to say, deal with all languages. Then often you have specialized courses that target specific language pairs. And on the other hand, we also see that the industry is, so to say, providing services in training. Most of you are probably aware of TALS in their industry program in post-editing and so on. So this is also something that we should consider, that we are not the only ones providing this training. What may be an obstacle in incorporating machine translation and post-editing into these different courses or different modules is technology, the technological framework that is given, and also the organizational framework. Here we can discuss first the generic machine translation, such as of course Google Translate and others, that may not be ideal in order to emulate a professional practice, to emulate the industry, versus customized machine translation or software as a service, which may not be accessible for all languages, for all domains, or may not be accessible to your institute. So this is something that should be considered when you decide to implement machine translation and post-editing as a professional practice into your course. You will also need other tools in order to supplement the machine translation framework, such as, for example, CAT tools, but also other quality assurance tools, other post-editing tools, or other tools that can, for example, track project management, process management, and so on. So this is quite an investment for the institutes. So what we observe is a general tendency toward the generic machine translation, but you should be aware that this is not something that is implemented in the professional context. So let's have a look. What are some of the learning outcomes that have been defined by our colleagues, by us, in sense of implementing machine translation, didactics, and machine translation post-editing. You're probably aware of one of the first works in this field by Sharon O'Brien in 2002. That is actually, so to say, the gold standard for all the further courses in this field. So O'Brien foresaw a theoretical component of a machine translation module or course or program that included knowledge of machine translation, terminology management, that we've also heard today, pre-editing and controlled language, which we see is not so much implemented in translation curricula anymore, and programming skills. So this was in 2002, and then programming skills slowly disappeared, as you will see. The practical component that O'Brien suggested was post-editing practice with at least 2 machine translation engines. So here comes again our technical framework, that we can have the language pair and the domain that we can test with 2 empty engines. Terminology management and coding, controlled language, corpus analysis, and programming. Here O'Brien was very much focused on macros that nowadays are not anymore so much in a topic. Of course, this framework suggested by O'Brien has developed further. If we have a look through history, so to say, there was much done by Doherty, Kenny, and so on. What came in 2010 and plus was very much focused on evaluating human versus automatic metrics. This is interesting in the sense of translation service provision in terms of quality, risk management, and so on. But of course, what also pertains to us, the roles of humans in these workflows. So this is not a new development and was very much a part of several courses already in 2012. Furthermore, the conceptualization of who we are, what is the translation role, and so on. We've heard this already today, so this is an ongoing topic. With a more prevalent machine translation used by language industry, we also see topics such as ethics, payment, and collaboration. Here, collaboration between different roles in workflow management, but also collaboration in sense of crowdsourcing that was also very much used for post-editing by the industry and so on. If we have a look at the latest development, we see a lot of studies dealing with metacognitive capacity, reflecting on deployment of language technologies. What does it mean for the translator's metacognitive skills and capacities? And also machine translation project management was suggested as one of the learning outcomes recently by our colleagues. So, how to implement this really diverse and big demand on outcomes into machine translation and machine translation post-editing into teaching. We are well aware of Kilari's approaches between transmissionist approach and transformational approach. So we see very much going from this theoretical approach in machine translation every student has probably heard the history of machine translation and so on, but this doesn't bring us much for the practice, right? So we see more and more of situated learning, of actually being immersed into a machine translation as a process and not anymore only as a tool that they use, but to be an active participant in the process that deals with machine translation and development of machine translation. So this very much brings us also in parallel to what we've done before, project-based learning for translation, also being emulated. Project-based learning, machine translation, and post-editing is also being done here. Some of the typical content that you will find in this project-based emerged learning scenarios are again some basic principles of MT technology. We will not come away from this. Then the types of engines on the market, customized, software as a service, and so on. The integration between CAD tools and MT systems, especially in the sense of adaptive CAD tools that work with translation memories and with machine translation. Then the machine translation output, what it is, how it looks like, what are the frequently occurring errors in one or other engine, and why do they occur. Then different machine translation evaluation approaches, types of evaluation, scoring, ranking, error categorization. There is a long list of various approaches to this. If you're interested, I have some literature for you at the end. And then, of course, the role of the people involved in the engine training and the implementation in the localization, translation, and workflow.